If I could have your attention.
Okay.
If I could have your attention, we are going to begin to move to our next conversation. 911 is here. Our attendee is up and is alert, and so thank you for your prayers.
No.
And we are excited to have three extraordinary individuals who will be to help us think about a social justice movement. So we want to continue this conversation. My name is Christophe Ringer. I serve as assistant professor of theological ethics and society here at the seminary. And to my immediate right is Prexy Nesbitt, who has been a teacher and lecturer for 40 years throughout Chicago and currently teaches African history at Columbia College in Chicago, is involved with teacher training nationally through Eastern Educational Collaborative, based in D.C. In addition, Prexy travels throughout the USA speaking on racism, war, and militarism issues, especially in relationship to Africa. He has done various jobs in Eastern and Southern Africa, ranging from education to foreign policy to trade union work since the mid-1960s. He also organizes cultural political tours to Africa through an organization he and others founded called Making the Road. We also have Bernadine Dohrn, who is with us, who is an activist, academic, international child rights and women's advocate, a retired clinical associate professor at Northwestern University School of Law, and founding director of the Children and Family Justice Center for 24 years. She is the author of numerous books, including Race Course Against White Supremacy, A Century of Juvenile Justice, Resisting Zero Tolerance, a handbook for parents, teachers, and students. And she is currently a visiting professor at Leiden University Faculty of Law in the Netherlands. And finally, with us is one of our board members here at Chicago Theological Seminary, the Reverend Starsky Wilson, who is a pastor, philanthropist, and activist, pursuing God's vision of community marked by justice, peace, and love. He's also the president and CEO of the Deaconess Foundation and a pastor of St. John's Church. He has led congregational activism on a number of issues, including youth violence prevention, Medicaid expansion, public school accreditation, voter mobilization, and capping payday lending and raising the minimum wage. So give a hand clap to all of our presenters here this morning. And what I'd like to do to get us started is to have each one of our panelists to reflect upon a recent statement given by Patrisse Cullors of the Black Lives Matter movement. She said that we didn't start a movement, we started a network. And she really speaks to the way in which this movement has gained organizational strength. It has affected local politics, national politics, and it has affected the nation. And I wanted each of you to just take a moment to reflect upon what happens when a social movement gains strength and gains recognition nationally and internationally. What kind of questions do they then need to ask themselves? What does it mean to exist in that space? What are the concerns? What are the kind of critical things that a movement needs to reflect upon in terms in going forward?
Can you hear me? Because I'm not sure about this.
I'm not either. Are we wired?
On or off. Can you hear me? Yes. You can't hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you very much. It's a very profound and very, very critical question. I did a little reflecting on this, not that particular question, but some reflecting on, and I'll try to be as cogent and quick as I can with my comments. I've been very fortunate because I've had the opportunity of working with movements of great significance in the United States, in Africa, in Europe, and to a lesser extent, maybe with some of the Latin American movements, particularly those coming out of Cuba. I think that one of the things that has to be most seriously dealt with is the question of leadership, and how is leadership done, and how is it perpetuated, how is it created, how is it sustained. And I think one of the things that I'm very impressed with Black Lives Matter and BPO 100 and all of the youth movements today is that they've moved the whole question of leadership to a different level.
Absolutely.
That they have created a new model for leadership. I remember waiting one whole afternoon, about 9 hours, when a person that I won't name announced us that he was running for president, and he wanted us to all come and advise him. Well, now, for a combination of circumstances, he never did show up. And all of us activists in Chicago were waiting around, and there was never an appearance made. And one of the things that I think was not a good characteristic of the leadership that we saw often was that it was so without any methods for training and bringing on board new leadership. And I experienced that both here in the United States with different movements, and I experienced it most dramatically with regard to the Mozambique liberation struggle, when the South African apartheid government shot down a plane that had on it the president of Mozambique, Samora Machel, and some 30 other major leaders were all on that plane. And after the crash, there was a major crisis because nobody had ever conducted a state funeral, and no one knew how to do it, and no one had been trained in it. So I think there's that aspect. I think the other aspect that I would observe and would mark, because I talk about it all the time in my classes, and I'm very struck and pleased by the way in which the youth activists today have corrected that to a very large extent, is there was no women leadership in many of the movements that I participated in the 60s and 70s. It was just amazing. It took time to even get to the point where you could have an observation, wait, there's no women on the speakers, but it's much deeper than that. It was the question of who did all the real work, who did all the mobilizing, who did all the talking, and who sat there and took all the credit as if they had done it. I find that still permeates certain things, though. I take, as our comrade moderator has indicated, I take people to South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, I'm starting to go to Cuba and Brazil. I'm very struck by something that happens every group that I take. It is invariably 80% women. And I really have begun to ask myself, why is it that men don't participate? And I think that's related to the kind of leadership that we saw in an earlier period. To deal with affective, emotional issues is not something that we men have yet become in any way halfway good at. And therefore, I think that we really have to hand it over to women, that the sisters lead it.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. I can't tell if this is on. I thought I'd take as an example the constellation of movements that in the last 25 years in Illinois, in Chicago, that fought for the elimination of the death penalty. I think of it as three great rivers kind of coming together. One of them being the movement to abolish the death penalty. One of them being the movement to expose the torture, systematic torture that was going on in Area 2 Police Station for 25 years in the Chicago Police Department, and the 150 black men who were tortured into false confessions there. And the other was the movement that started in the early, late 90s about wrongful convictions and how police interrogations happen and why people plead guilty. And those movements, in my experience, were somewhat independent, somewhat proprietary about who'd been doing the work the longest. But in fact, they became really torrents when they came together by the late 90s. And the reason that they're important is because I think, you know, I feel very proud to live in a state that abolished the death penalty. It took really forever, but I think Illinois, you know, was able to actually do that legally finally, and have really a majority of the citizens understand why it was a horrible, horrible punishment and why it was a racist tool, really, of the criminal justice system. And also that the way that the torture justice worked out has continued to unfold. So one of the amazing things to me is that after the Burge was finally indicted, John Burge, do you all know who he was? Yeah. After he was finally indicted, and some of his victims were able to testify at his trial and sentencing hearing. And, you know, of course, he was charged with nothing federal crimes at the end of the day, right? Just tiny little offenses, not with torture. It was too late for that and so on. But it was a very important kind of public airing of the harm that was done by him and many others, and the silence that permeated the entire criminal justice system, prosecutors, judges. It wasn't simply one rogue police officer, that's for sure. To have that played out was so extraordinary. But the next thing that emerges, really thanks to Black Lives Matter and to the next generation of youth, is the torture justice reparations struggle. And so coming off of that, it's not done yet. And what happened here in Chicago, I think people still don't know in Chicago, and you do, but a class I spoke to last night didn't know right here in Chicago. It is an extraordinary development. And so after Black Lives Matter and other forces in the city joined together to campaign, and here I want to emphasize Prexy's point, the mothers of the people who were falsely incarcerated, falsely accused, or even who were correctly accused, and people who were buried alive on death row, life sentences, the dungeons that we call the prison system in Illinois, the mothers of those people were the backbone of this struggle. They never gave up. They never stopped going to visit. You know, you have to drive 7 hours. You have to have resources to get to go do a visit in prison. Often when you get there, you don't get to see your loved one. The visiting is shut down. People are locked up. This group of women, really largely unheralded, not the organizers themselves, were the backbone of keeping this struggle alive and building allies over decades. And then along come the kids the last 5 years, and they, sorry to call them kids, you know what I mean, the young people who represent the new organizing core. And what they created was a Torture Justice Memorial, finally signed off by, of all people, Mayor Emanuel, and of all people, the Chicago City Council. Astonishing package, nothing like it in American history. Really, reparations, something that's been, you know, in the air as a theoretical proposition and an idea and an obvious possible partial remedy for centuries of racism and white supremacy, thievery in the United States. But a gorgeous package of remedies. Partial, not adequate, but beautiful in its scope, in its humanity, in its artistic representation. So what happened last Christmas Day. 100 African-American men got a check for $100,000 each. Not barely enough. They received an apology from Rahm Emanuel in the city of Chicago for decades of torture denied and hidden over and covered over and not acknowledged. They received a community college education for themselves, their children, and their grandchildren for free going forward. There's going to be a curriculum to be taught in the public grade schools and high schools of Chicago Public Schools about the police torture case, developed by a community of people, including the mothers, the guys themselves, and the organizers who worked there for all these years. There's going to be a monument, an artistic expression, so that people who come to Chicago and get on the tourist circuit will see, like Haymarket, like how long it took us to get a Haymarket memorial, will see that this happened here and that we don't forget. And finally, there will be a torture treatment center, like the Kovler Center is on the north side, in Area 2 on the south side, staffed to treat generations who suffered from police torture that was unacknowledged and unrecognized. That's an incredible package. It's a humane, and it doesn't even begin to get to the heart of the matter, but it makes it a living memorial in a way that I think is just extraordinary. And I think it's due in many ways, as Prexy just mentioned, to the young queer feminist lens movement that put it together. And it isn't in the name of the most powerful speaker. It isn't in the name of somebody who can debate with other people. And it really is grounded in community organizing and campaign building in the finest sense. I think we all should be very lucky to be in Chicago and part of that history.
Thank you.
Thank you. As one who's not so lucky, because I had to drive to Chicago, I want to express appreciation first for the opportunity to be here and to share, and for the opportunity to respond to the prompt in the quote from Patrisse Cullors. Patrisse is a friend. Patrisse is a warrior. We had the occasion to host Patrisse and the 400 brilliant, multi-racial, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, and folks of non-faith who organized on the strength of a hashtag 2.5 weeks and a good idea to descend upon Ferguson before the end of August of 2014 for the Black Lives Matter Freedom Ride in August. And there really kind of began our relationship of sharing back and forth. And the reason why I'm trying to find an excuse to get to LA next week to pray with her and her newborn. So I want to give a little context to the quote. So this quote is from an article that Patrisse wrote last February. It came out in February. In the week when she was scheduled to come to St. Louis and speak along with Opal and Alicia at Webster University, and they canceled the appearance. Part of what was going on was that people on the ground were not happy that they were coming, largely because of the frame that the university and many of us across the nation have placed on the BLM network. And people calling them founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, which they are very articulately reframe as the movement for Black lives. And they're very intentional to say, as she says in this quote, we started a network, not a movement. And it gets to this, in the context, gets to the question that you asked, Dr. Ringer, what are the critical questions, what are the critical things that movements must be responsive to? And so I think about two things. Number one, I think about Howard Thurman's question that he suggests that Jesus woke up with every day in Jesus and the Disinherited. How might I respond to Rome? And I think this is the question that we're seeing meted out over the course of this election year. How will the movement respond to Rome, the center of power, electoral politics, individuals who seek a presidency in the context of a critical conversation, not just about mass incarceration, but about race, racism, and America's original sin. How do I relate to them? And some have decided that my role is to challenge them, to build a structure, to shift the conversation, and to push them into conversations they don't want to have. That, quite frankly, is the option that the BLM network has chosen. There's another option. There's a Campaign Zero option. Mm-hmm. And so people identify as one of the most, I'm using the language of our mainstream media, one of the most visible Black Lives Matter activists, DeRay McKesson, who wouldn't identify that way necessarily. The head of one of the 4 young leaders who established Campaign Zero, which is a policy initiative focused squarely on police violence and accountability, where they have researched some of the top 10 most broadly accepted consensus public policies to advance police accountability, put them together in Campaign Zero, and began to negotiate directly with heads of the Department of Justice, meetings with the president, with the presidential candidates, and to directly say that my role is to inform and to speak directly to the emperor. Not to challenge or push the emperor necessarily, but to offer the emperor options on what they may do to be responsive. The first critical question that movements must answer is, how might I respond to Rome? The second question, to riff on Thurman a bit, and to put it into the context that Patrice was getting into that week when she wrote that article. And we should, again, note the context. She's 9 months pregnant writing this. She's 9 months pregnant. She's in phone calls overnight, because I was in North Carolina that week, and I had phone calls with at least 4 activists in the city in St. Louis, because it was popping up on social media that folks on the ground who had moved with them, who organized with them, who expressed love and support with them, were saying, yeah, we're going to see who founded what. We'll meet you at Webster. So it wasn't about hospitality. Right? And so people are still trying, I mean, and to be clear, I mean, the convening in July of 2015 in Cleveland for the Movement for Black Lives, with people from all over the country, there was a closed-door session with folks from Ferguson, and you map the network and you see that there is no BLM chapter in St. Louis or Ferguson. Well, what's that? Because we must constantly negotiate the question of how might I respond to Nazareth as well, or Soweto. The space, the localized spaces where there is work happening already, where perhaps there's an uprising, where perhaps there is an expression of pain, where perhaps there is this flashpoint. If I'm not of that, but I am engaged in appropriate, responsive leadership, what does my relationship there look like? Because let us be honest, let us be clear, all of us who were able to make an appointment to be here on today and to meet that appointment, whether we were on cautious politicians' time or any other time, we are at best middle class. And most people who have access to a mic in the context of a movement are middle class. They're not necessarily of the margins of the margins. So in many ways, many of us are, I'm sorry? Yeah, in many ways, many of us are speaking for someone else. So let's just keep that real, right? And so we make it to the mic because we've got some access to the credentials of the establishment, the ecclesia, or the empire. And so we've got to be clear about how we will respond to, how we will be accountable to, how we will speak with, for, behind, and amplify the voices of Nazareth. And so what's critical about that is the decision, we're not coming to St. Louis. And we're going to cancel on the institution and the establishment because the relationships and context are what we need to work on. And we're going to frame how and why we're doing this because we understand an accountability to those whom we love, support, and desire to move with. And so I think the context of who owns it, who owns us, whom we work for, and who we get to work with are these critical matters. And they're much more critical in something like an election year like this, when we've got to dance and figure out whether we're going to even attempt to dance in a presidential campaign with all of its kind of rigmarole and think whether we can connect it, whether we can impact it or not, or whether we're going to dance locally and figure out, like some folks like Pastor McBride and others with PICO, it's like, we're going to move locally in some of these sheriff's races and some of these prosecutors' races, and we're going to impact those. So I think these are critical questions that maturing movements have to deal with. How will I respond to Rome, and how will I respond to Nazareth?
Wonderful, thank you for that. And if I could just really briefly riff off of Thurman as well. Howard Thurman has a wonderful quote where he says, "How can I be me without making it difficult for you being you?" And so I say that to talk about, I want to ask about the art of relationship building in social movements. Yeah. Because part of what happens is, and you mentioned D. Ray, I think D. Ray is an important kind of person to talk about, because D. Ray comes into a moment right, with relationships with Teach for America, right, which then become a point of controversy with other organizers who are organizing around charter schools, right? Other people come into this moment with a background in organizing or with relationships with the church. So, and then out of that, people begin to, you can almost see people nationally being mapped out in different spaces. Right? And oftentimes we don't have the luxury of having closed-door meetings. I'm thinking about the Dream Defenders, who they said, we're going to take 6 months off of social media. Because we got caught up in battling people online, and it took away from the work in the community. So if each of you could just speak to the art, the importance, and frankly, the tactics sometimes that are necessary in relationship building to keep social movements alive.
I think that one of the things that I have most trouble with our organizing today is that there's very little trust being built in that organizing. And I don't see electronic social network organizing as a vehicle that in any way enhances the growth of trust. I've been very involved with a network effort called the U.S. Africa Network for the last 2 years. We have had some successes, you might say. We have no office, we have no coordinator, we have no budget, but we've been able to put together a counter to Obama's massive summit that was very oriented towards the corporations last year in Washington, D.C. We've been able to put together a traveling group that raised the relationship of climate justice issues to the United States and to African countries, and we're currently trying to do an initiative around that is a follow-up to what's come out of Africa that's called the Stop the Bleeding campaign. And the bleeding consists of the way in which capital raised on the backs of African people, products that have been produced by African people, that all of that profit and money doesn't ever get back into Africa, but instead goes into tax havens all over the world, many of which are in cities in the United States. And what it leads to is the bleeding that you see in Africa. The fact that they don't have social service networks that can provide and meet the crises that come along, whether it's a mosquito that is wreaking havoc, or whether it's something like Boko Haram. And there is instead also the opening up of all of Africa to the militarization of the African continent by the current Western administrations led by the United States. The two movements that I think I have seen that I think are in many ways an outgrowth of what happened here in Chicago in 1965-66 with the Freedom Summer. One is the movement that was an effort to elect a mayor of this Chicago by a man named Harold Washington. And related to that was last year's effort to elect a real mayor as opposed to a glorified pimp who loves to have rich stuff on the north side and on Michigan Avenue. I think his name is Rom. Is that his name? Romulus. It fits better with what he was saying earlier. So I point to that movement, but I point to another movement too. I think that one of the most incredible moments we've had of social movement building, and here I very much agree with the comments made by Bernard, where he was differentiating between a movement and a moment or an organization. A movement was the anti-apartheid movement in the United States. I'd add to that the anti-apartheid and pro-Africa solidarity movement. Solidarity in the same way that Aboriginal Australian activist woman used the term, if you've come to help me, then forget about it. But if you come because your solidarity, your help is linked to my help, my situation, then we're on it. Come on and join us. I think that movement of the African Solidarity movement has spawned many other movements. You can go across this country and ask people who are doing social activist or justice work anywhere and ask them, well, where'd you cut your eye teeth? And what they'll say again and again was in doing anti-apartheid work. And I think that spawned class issues, my brother. I very much agree with you that we do sit here as a group that represents a certain class background and advantage, although it may be great variance, I ain't in the group here that's sitting with $100,000 income. I'm in the group with banks, so I owe the banks about $60,000. And I'm trying to think of a way to maybe do some action like Denzel Washington did with that hospital, in that movie Hospital. Do you all know what he's talking about? Where Denzel looked at this situation with his child about to die, and here's this whole hospital, and he said, shit, how do I take this whole thing over? And I'm looking at these banks and saying, man, I'm talking to my students, and they're saying, yeah, Mr. Nesbitt, I'm owed $90,000 when I finish. Yeah. And they tell me about their plans to do it. I said, you ain't ever going to pay back $90,000. Now, come on with me, and let's talk about some Robin Hood stuff that we can try to create in the future, all right? To do that, we have to do what's called, and I'm going to finish up real quick, because I ain't a man with a lot of words. I think one of the things we have to do is commit class suicide. Cabral talks about that. It's one of the most important concepts that we can have. I'm often struck in this country, but how little the most progressive Americans I know will talk about their money. Some of the most progressive. I don't mind saying to my whole class, I am broke. My son says, Daddy, you ain't poor, you're po. And he says, I don't want to live like you. But that's something that's part of the whole question of how do you commit class suicide. Another thing that I'll finish with. If I didn't get any other lesson out of years of working with African liberation movements, it was the lesson of trying to find out who is the enemy. Who are we really fighting against? And while I have complete, utter respect for everything Bernadine talked about with what we've done in this city with regard to getting a reparations thing through, I didn't ever think I'd read in my lifetime the Chicago Tribune having a headline story that said the Chicago Police Department is guilty of systematic racism.
I know.
Coming from the Chicago Tribune, I thought somebody planted this paper.
They're in trouble.
Somebody planted the paper.
Let's
but
say
here's what I
trouble.
think.
They're in trouble.
Here's where I think where we got to move further forward. And that is, how do we begin to more systematically analyze and look at these problems and come up with some conclusions that are based in more capacity to build power and to build organization. For example, I think the Panther Party made a huge mistake. I talked with them at that part. I said all along, we can't fight the police militarily. I think we're making a big mistake. And I continue to feel that to analyze this thing in terms of the policeman as our enemy is to make a huge error. Rather, it's to analyze the system that is behind individual police. We know where the police live in this city. You all know as well as I do. The northwest side, the southwest side, they're working class families, basically, who've gotten a break by getting into the police department, often illegally, often through knowing the right person. Oh, yeah. All right? That's what it's about. They are not about being trained in any serious way to tackle the problems that we have in this society. There is no way that you can turn to the police department to deal with the crisis around mental issue, the crisis around domestic assault that's going on in this society today. So how do we begin to move to a point that we analyze this thing in such a way that we begin to look at and retrain police, reorient them? It means getting into some of these racist neighborhoods, which another wonderful thing that young whites are doing that I appreciate is really starting to do the thing of working with these racists. Organizations like Surge, Show Up for Racial Justice. They're really trying to get into these communities on the northwest and northwest and southwest sides, areas that we couldn't even go in, and still might not go in. Bernadine, you and I are walking together in the evening, even now. But how do you get into reorienting the minds, particularly of the young people of those generations? And I think that stems from developing a real analysis that is based on a close study of the terrain and the people that we're working at. And that's great variety. There's great variety in this country. I just finished doing a 2,500-mile trip down all through the South. I came back to southern Illinois, a little town called Anna. Anybody know Anna, Illinois? Check it out. Stands for Ain't No Niggas Allowed. Right down near Cairo. And I said to myself after this trip, the South's going to make it before we do. South's going to make it before Chicago does. Because there are people down there that are willing to confront the stuff and talk about it and really struggle with it. It's like in South Africa. And South Africa's in trouble. I'm going to finish right now. South Africa is in trouble today, brothers and sisters. Some of the most serious trouble that I have ever seen it be. And I think a lot of that came from the fact that the process of study and involvement and engagement and study and a continual process of doing that was not deep enough.
If I just want to ask one quick question, then I want to open it up for the audience. And maybe, Reverend Wilson, you could also maybe start with this. You mentioned reorienting minds and the analysis of systems. Right? For those of us who occupy seminary spaces, right, what kind of education do we need, right, to really support these movements? Right? How do we then institutionalize a kind of pedagogy, right, that really focuses on how do you analyze systems, reorient minds? What does that look like?
Yeah. No, I appreciate the question. I think, and I'm going to try to kind of blend these because I wanted to speak to the last question as well. I think a great deal of it has to do with this matter of relationship building and recognition that particularly those who occupy clerical spaces have a responsibility to blur lines of relationship. The priestly office has a unique function. It has the capacity to make the profane sacred and make the sacred profane, right? To purify something. So I've talked about this as the role of clergy. Like we weren't going down there engaging in protest action that were led by young people as any manner to protect them, but in many ways our presence sanctified holy rage. So we took what some folks call profane and made it sacred through our presence, right? And so I think this capacity to navigate different spaces and relationships call for, and we have this responsibility to facilitate trust building. To get to the last question, trust and relationship building among folks who would not be with one another otherwise. So I have to, for the sake of full disclosure, note that I'm a member of the board of directors for Teach for America St. Louis. So I know DeRay on a couple of levels. Brittany, I work with because I'm on her board. And I also work with folks in public education who can't stand this kind of whole education reform kind of movement. And so that stuff has to show up, and we have to be able to negotiate for the sake of relationship, for the sake of the work, with integrity these different spaces. So in the movement that shows up, because I'm in just as much relationship with Jamie Wooten, who asked DeRay when he comes to Baltimore, who are you and who sent you? Because he's a local community organizer engaged in the life of the church, and suggests that DeRay's coming from a neoliberal space that that's pushing a particular agenda and is not effectively in relationship with the ground. And what I'm saying is, if there's going to be real trust, there has to be that kind of relationship, and there has to be the capacity to ask those kinds of questions, right? And so we've got to be able to push one another on issues if we're going to do that. So part of the pedagogy of spaces like this has to be inviting people to own and be authentic enough in themselves if they can stand with integrity in separate spaces with divergent viewpoints, and recognize, quite frankly, that if you're really doing church, synagogue, mosque in a different way, then you should have divergent viewpoints in the space. And so your responsibility to relationship, your capacity to engage, so some of this basic community organize, I know it's old school. So the capacity I didn't learn this in seminary. I learned how to do it one-on-one because I went to Gamaliel training. Right? So the capacity to run a one-on-one, to get a sense of people's passions, to be thoughtful about how you move those passions together. And yes, basic power map, I know, we like to talk about it, social analysis. So, I mean, some of that, we need those basics, and unfortunately they're not taught. But I think they also need to be taught in community. So in as much as we can engage that in community and know that part of that, it's not an aside, right? So I was a member of the Social Justice Council at my seminary. But why isn't that core to the curriculum, right? Why aren't we helping folks to understand that if you're going into a local congregation, particularly in the Protestant mainline today, you're either going there to be a chaplain and give hospice care to it, because it's declining because everything else in the Protestant mainline is declining, or you're going there to reinvigorate the space. And so tools of community organizing can be helpful to you in that direct work, but quite frankly, also putting that in the context of what the church ought to be, which is a movement. And I'll stop here.
Can I just say one quick thing?
Oh, yeah.
I'm just going to say one quick thing, because you all should jump in. To me, the only thing I'd add to this conversation is that I think that in my life experience, people understand systems underneath the issues of struggles, become radicalized, as we say, when issues come together. And so the biggest one, that Prexy and I lived through was the Black Freedom Movement and the Vietnam War. And of course, Dr. King epitomized but didn't start. Yet it was much earlier on the ground with SNCC and with the radical edges and Malcolm X and so on, that put these issues, two big issues, public issues of the moment, together, linked them as a structure that went together. And of course, the guys coming back from Vietnam, as today, the women and men coming back from wars, have a lot to tell us. And I think the veterans movement has, as they come back home, have a vision about war and peace that is something that all struggles have to have put together. So I just want to add that question of war and peace to the conversation that we're having, because we live in a nation that's addicted to war, can't stop it, it's the biggest nuclear power, and so on. And I want to add one last word, which is about Palestine. I was astonished last night to hear Palestine emerge in the rather stupid debates in Brooklyn. But I do think that the fact is that young people have now recognized that this is a core social justice issue, that we cannot stand for what's being done in our name in terms of weapons and money and 100% support for Israel and the endless seizing of land and occupation of Palestine. So I do feel like it's young people in this country who have changed their mind, added this to the radical agenda, and insisted, even Jewish young people as much as Arab and black young people, that this is an issue for our time.
If I could make one rhetorical corrective, and I try to, and a historical one as well, these folk ain't young, they're movement age.
Good point.
There's
Sorry,
no major
that's
movement.
too
There's no major
patronizing
movement.
to say young.
No, it's not. It's just historically inaccurate.
Their movement.
That movements are led by people who are this age. So if you're talking about a movement and you're talking about
Good
an
point.
18-year-old, they're the appropriate leader.
But I think I think you got to change that even, because many times the leaders may be 6, 7, and 8-year-olds.
Yes.
You know, just like what was it, brother Bernard was saying this morning.
Yeah.
It was that child that best
Yes.
understood.
Yes.
And in the Soweto struggle, it was 7, 8, 9, and 10-year-olds who went and ended up being the guerrilla freedom fighters.
Yes.
Yeah,
We got to
Birmingham,
let
too.
people hear.
Sure.
We-
Of course.
What was that
The
sign they
children.
just flashed?
But you're right.
10 minutes.
Movement.
We got to give these people a chance.
Yeah,
to
we
get it.
want to get at least. Okay, let's take these two questions over here.
We'll be quick, too.
My question comes in the context of we are in our 100-year centennial celebration of blacks being in the northern city for 100 years. Also comes from a proletariat perspective, from Walter Lee Bigger Thomas cultural perspective. And it also understands that we're looking at the regentrification of the South Lakefront right in our faces. Mm-hmm. The last election in the 5th District was about who was going to control the real estate from a state perspective, where they're going to build the presidential library. All right? There's no discussion. Matter of fact, the University of Chicago is still paying a 3-card Monte game. Again, you got to go back and pull up your little face, look up facial deconcentration, the systematic removal of 3 out of 4 blacks to make it safe for white people to re-inhabit the inner cities across this country was born here in 1940 with Anthony Downs. So understand the historical context. I'm a 5th-generation native Chicagoan, right? Read the book Black Metropolis. We've been building Bronzeville for 30 years, right? Now when it's time for Bronzeville to become world class, you got a new city being built called McCormick Square. When you look at who's on the board, all the gangsters are there. McCarthy just resigned, right? Who'd he go get a job from? The gangsters, right? You talking about the real gangsters in this town. What's the deal? Where is Mr. Strand-Mattis? Is he here? Michael Strand-Mattis, who is the Obama, he's the Obama civic engagement person, right? And he's up in the Eiffel Tower in Hopper Court at 5225. You can't even get to him to have a conversation about where's the economics? Where's the Marshall Plan for Jim Reynolds, who's with Mayor Romulus, right? The question becomes, where's the economic emancipation to break the cycle of poverty that we fought to get to the northern city? We're in the northern city right now. They're pushing us off this land right in our faces, buying off our leadership, right? And killing our children on the streets of Chicago. So what is the plan? Where's the Marshall Plan, Jim Lewis, for economic empowerment in black metropolis, so after 100 years we can break the cycle of poverty and create wealth and go upscale like the rest of Chicago?
Want to do a bunch of questions? And
Yeah,
then
there's so
we
many
can
questions
respond?
on that.
Why don't we focus on the question of economic emancipation?
Okay.
Because I think that also goes to when you mentioned not only focusing on the police, but rather the economic interests that the police protect. So thinking about
74% of us getting busted in the head, right? It ain't the white people. It ain't Hispanics. They get 14%. They empowering the Hispanics at our expense at this point. They built
Well-
this country on our back. We're in the northern city. We need to break the cycle of poverty. Stop killing our children. Where's our economic foundation, Mayor Romulus and Governor Rodney and Michael Madigan? Right? All through the credit millionaires off the taxpayers' backs. Right? Look at what's going on in the corner place. Right?
I think, my brother, that the recognizing the fierce urgency of every question you just posed, I think the real challenge we have is to get many ordinary people, including a lot of black folk, to understand those very questions and to be able to articulate them with the same kind of force and clarity that you just did. When we've got that happening, then I think we have the beginnings of a movement that can get rid of Mr. Romulus.
I want to also suggest that, and this is not to run away from the structural questions, but I do believe, I actually just did a study on this earlier this week with a small group, that we will absolutely never we will not engage in subversion of extreme capitalism with the tools of capitalism. And so it seems to me part of what needs to be cultivated is a context and a spirit of generosity in a manner that it critiques that capital structure. And even as we're seeing growing up in Ferguson and St. Louis, systems of bartering and alternative economics within community that, I mean, quite frankly, reflective of the people of the way, that I just won't put my money in that system. Rather, I'll share my goods in this system, and we'll meet all one another's needs. I actually believe, maybe that's a foolhardy thing in intellectual context, I actually believe that reorienting how we engage our resources to one another, and even sharing and bartering in as much as we have to participate in systems of transaction and capitalism is part of how you actually subvert that system. I also do not believe that ever people are going to give you the stuff that they have hoarded up for themselves systemically. Yeah. And so part of the economic conversation has to be a power conversation, and in an election year, then I think we've got to be very clear about things like Mary Frances Berry's recent book about $5 and a pork chop sandwich. That's what actually buys votes, this system of vote buying within our context, and recognize that places where we've been able to accumulate African-American wealth and make African-American millionaires is places where we've been able to get African-American political power. And so I think those have to be real things. So those are my kind of contextual reflections on that.
Can I just interrogate that one comment? I am absolutely not certain that building African-American millionaires builds African-American political power.
No, actually what I was arguing was the other. So when you look at Maynard Jackson and you look at Andrew Young in Atlanta, they built political power first, and then the African-American millionaires came next. I don't believe the African-American millionaires served to facilitate a virtuous cycle to create more political power.
Because one of the other things you get when you build millionaires is you build a structure and system that automatically creates poor people.
Yeah.
Who ain't going to have nothing to do
Again,
with
I'm not
no
arguing
participation.
for it. I'm not arguing for it. I am arguing that in the absence of political power, the economic power that you seek, you're not ever going to accumulate. I'm suggesting that that's going to be it's going to be a fool's errand to even talk about it, or quite frankly, you'll just be a crying person asking other people for stuff, which makes you less powerful.
I think as we look at racism, you got to look at capitalism. Yeah. And you got to, classism is part of the basis of capitalism. So we have to, and one of the things that I'm happy about is that through Occupy and through Ferguson and through Black Lives Matter and through all these young brothers and sisters on the street, they're taking it to a different level of not just looking at race, but looking at class and looking at how this whole economic system works globally, because I got to shut up.
And climate change.
It's good stuff. I just want to make sure we get one more question in.
And climate change, too.
Climate change, too.
And also, it raises the question of who are our allies. Because no group can do it alone. Right. No group that's on the bottom. No group that is outside of the profit system here. So both of those are urgent questions, I think.
I just wanted to take off on what Dr. Nesbitt talked about.
Just Prexy, please, sister. Because we got to interrogate this system of all these titles, too.
Thank you. Prexy said about solidarity. I've been a community organizer for the past 3 decades, I guess, starting in Brooklyn, New York, and I took those skills to the northern suburbs of Chicago, where for over 22 years I've been running a fair housing group. And one of the things that needs to be part of this conversation has to be this overall analysis that you don't have an Englewood, for example, or extreme poverty unless you have a Kenilworth or a Winnetka. and that if you're really going to change systems, people in these communities who have a sense of, you use the term solidarity, you might also use the term enlightened self-interest, or the sense that somebody else's pain is my pain too. And so the extent to which we can empower and work with folks in those communities, even if it's one unit of affordable housing that you get in Winnetka, begins to chip away at the system, because we have to also analyze the fact that home rule in Illinois started in 1970, which was very much a way, I think, and other historians think, to defund public schools in Chicago. So there's a whole edifice in terms of building a movement for justice that has to take into, that can't just be on the backs of the people who are directly affected, but has to encompass some teaching around, a sense of enlightened self-interest in, I guess, what you're talking about with class suicide, but a real change, and that encompasses all people. And I just wondered if you looked at that, because so much of movements, the reason we still have the problems we do is that it's all on the backs of one class of people to make change.
So, as a final statement, we've our conversation has moved not only from the question of class, but also capitalism, economic emancipation. So, if you would, just the relationship of social movements and capitalism, a final brief statement from each of you, and we'll wrap up.
I'm gathering my thoughts, but I do want to say this. I think that one of the things that most impressed me when I worked as a 19-year-old with the Union Den slums and Dr. King and the Freedom of Summer and people like Bernadine Dohrn and Reverend James Orange was they had a broad view of things. And I remember going with James Orange up to the Congregational Church in Winnetka, and I was trying to figure out why are we all the way up there. I mean, I knew that north side. Why are we going all the way up here? But now I understand it much more fundamentally. And I understand it fundamentally because I have about 8 students somewhere around here working for this project. And I know what you said earlier about bringing along those youth, and I'm really impressed with the youth coming out of some of those middle class and upper class families who are really moving down the road to do that class suicide and to say, I'm defined by the new world that we're creating.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, when Dr. King came to Chicago, and I hurled myself onto the west side in Warren Avenue Church as a law student, a second-year law student who knew nothing, and I knew nothing, and watched Dr. Lafayette, among others, who had been in the South, who were my age, exactly, but who'd lived an incredible life, challenging power. It changed me. And I think that is happening continually to young people today. It's happening to young people from every racial group. You put yourself into the struggle, trying to figure out how to be helpful with your eyes wide open, and let yourself be taught, and put yourself with somebody you can learn from, throw yourself into the struggle, and in a way that is, not I'm here, but is watching and learning and listening. And I think that happens again and again. I went from that to live in Uptown. Okay, there were poor whites in Chicago, really poor whites in Chicago. There still are, actually. But there was a group coming from Appalachia, right, who were organizing themselves, welfare mothers who were organizing themselves. So I think that you see, once you see a struggle, once you are engaged in a struggle, you see it. You see it happening in different communities, and you see who you have to make your alliances with. I think that's hugely important.
Thank you.
Dr. Carrie Day of Bright Divinity School published a book entitled Unfinished Business, where she talked about the economic realities of particularly black women in America and connected that to the reality of the economic and addressing capitalism as the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. I think that's I think that's absolutely right. I think it also, what she does is she calls on the historic black church tradition to take up that work, and I think she does so in the spirit of what we saw just this week. The lectionary reading for this past Sunday, for those of us in the Christian tradition, was from John chapter 21. It is an absolute rip. John chapter 21 does not exist. The 30th and the 31st verses of John chapter 20 close up the whole book. They say what it was about. That was actually the end. That's what the gospel writer wrote. John chapter 21 comes because there's a community, there's a Johannine community, people who have been influenced by the writings, the teachings, the relationships of the original writer, and they see questions that have been yet unanswered. They see unfinished business. So the community crafts the 21st chapter in order to wrap up all of these unanswered questions. So the reality of social movements and capitalism in America is that we've got some unanswered questions, we've got some unfinished business, and it's our responsibility to write a new chapter.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'll give our presenters a hand clap. Well, thank you for all that they have shared with us today.
I'm going to give them a couple
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ringer. Thank you to all of our panelists. That was really great. And you have a lot of unanswered questions and work to do, so I think we'll feed you next. But I do want to take a minute to thank our partners. First of all, the Chicago Community Trust, who supported this conference in a very big way. They love the work we're doing. That means they love the work you're doing. So if you have a chance to thank the Chicago Community Trust on our behalf, please do so. Also, we had an anonymous donor who believed in the work being done at this conference and the work that the breadth and width of our speakers and our attendees are doing, that they felt it was important to give a substantial amount to support the kind of work we do. So I wanted to make sure we recognize them in our thoughts today and thank them. We do have Chicago Sunday Evening Club, who is here on premise with us, and they're conducting interviews. In fact, I think we have a couple of our speakers who should probably head down to second floor now to be interviewed, but they want to talk to all of you too. So if you're roaming the building and you see a camera, stop and chat with them. It's like a small 5-minute, how is this working for you? What are you learning? Where are you from? What are you doing? And we're going to push those on social media. And if you don't want to, it's not required. Be sure to visit the Seminary Co-op bookstore and our CTS store that has RiotCon gear and CTS gear. They're on the 3rd floor. B-Gab's Goodies, who made our delicious lunches that are out in the hallway here. They are our dear friends from Hyde Park. They are a partner on this conference. They've done phenomenal work for the food for us today. And their box lunch is here on the 4th floor and on the 2nd floor, so you don't all have to rush to this floor and look at that spread of boxes and think there aren't enough. There are. If you see boxes marked gluten-free or nut-free, please leave those for the people who selected those. Lunch chats, B-Gabs is also running a juice bar, and I wanted to tell you that last so I don't lose you, but they're right next door, running their juice bar today during lunch and all day tomorrow. If you haven't had that, make it a stop on your conference itinerary. What else? Lunch chats are next. If you signed up for a lunch chat, just pick up your box of lunch and proceed to the room listed. If you just need a break, the dining room is next door and have a seat. Again, lunches are on 2nd and 4th floors, and Juma prayer begins at 12:45, and the afternoon workshops at 1 o'clock. Any quick questions I can answer logistically? This building opened in January of 2011, I believe. Am I right? If you love this facility, please talk to us. We do rent it out, especially to community groups. And we're really proud of it. It means a lot to us. It's a LEEDS Gold building, and it's dear to our hearts. So just ask anybody in an orange shirt, and we can tell you more. Where are the bathrooms? Bathrooms are on every single floor, right across from the elevator bay. Thanks, everybody.